Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven and tonight I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, we really must stop meeting like this.
I was going to say the same thing. It's a real coincidence. You just happen to be in the same place at the same time on a Wednesday afternoon. And as always, though, all jokes aside, looking forward to the show and always good to be sharing the stage with you, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to it as well. And it's a very, very big show tonight because, of course, as you've probably already heard, austerity is back. That's thanks to Rachel Reeves' spring statement this afternoon. We'll be going to Gaza to look at the impact of Israel's genocide in the enclave on children in particular. And we'll have a look at more of the signal chat capers coming out of the US State Department. Chancellor Rachel Reeves has given her spring statement to the House of Commons, billed as simply an update on the nation's finances. The Treasury had already briefed there would be no new taxes. No wealth taxes, no new taxes on the highest earners, and no new taxes on corporations. That means that we knew going in there would be cuts, unless Reeves decided to revise her famous fiscal rules around borrowing. That didn't happen, even though the £9.9 billion of fiscal headroom, essentially the spare cash for tax cuts or spending increases that she said the rules gave her in October, has all been wiped away. Instead, Reeves took a lesson from the playbook of the last Tory government and blamed everyone else except herself.
Now our task is to secure Britain's future in a world that is changing before our eyes. The threat facing our continent was transformed when Putin invaded Ukraine. It has since escalated further and will continue to evolve rapidly. At the same time, the global economy has become more uncertain, bringing insecurity at home as trading patterns become more unstable and borrowing costs rise for many major economies.
Look, let's agree that the world is an unstable place. That's true. There are the risk of tariffs, there's a war in Europe. But given that instability, wouldn't you really want a chancellor who can respond to the uncertainty by, I don't know, rethinking the rules she's boxed herself in with, or maybe getting imaginative about tax? That definitely wasn't Reeves's direction of travel. Instead, she hit those who can afford it least.
Last week, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, set out this government's plans to reform the welfare system. The Labour Party is the party of work. We believe that if you can work, you should work. But if you can't work, you should be properly supported. This government inherited a broken system. More than 1,000 people every day are qualifying for personal independence payments. 1 in 8 young people are not in employment, education, or training. If we do nothing, we are writing off an entire generation. That cannot be right, and we will not stand for it. It is a waste of their potential, and it is a waste of their futures, and we will change it. As my right honourable friend said in her statement last week, the final costings would be subject to the OBR's assessment. Today, the OBR have said that they estimate that the package will save £4.8 billion in the welfare budget, reflecting their judgments on behavioural effects and wider factors. This also reflects final adjustments to the overall package, consistent with the Secretary of State's statement last week and the government's Pathways to Work Green Paper. The Universal Credit Standard Allowance will increase from £92 per week in 25-26 to £106 a week by 29-30, while the Universal Credit Health element will be cut for new claimants by around 50% and then frozen.
Now that last part is new. Last week, the cut to the health component of universal credit was announced, a full 50% cut for new claimants, as Reeves tried to find an extra £5 billion to make up for the loss of her fiscal headroom. But the decision to freeze them wasn't announced last week. That new cut, and it is a cut because it means the value of the money claimants receive will drop with inflation, came about because the Office for Budget Responsibility disputed whether the cuts already announced would amount to £5 billion. So in short, you've got Rachel Reeves and Work and Pension Secretary Liz Kendall getting their sums wrong. And to get them right, they had to help themselves to more from Britain's sick and disabled. And of course, you'll remember that the rhetoric around the welfare cuts is that they're the moral thing to do. They're the right thing to do because they'll get people back into work, and work is really, really good for people. But today's move, I think, really busts that little homily wide open, because the extra money taken from universal credit today isn't about getting people back to work. It's simply about making sure that Reeves reaches that 5 billion top line figure. So she got the sums wrong. Disabled and sick people have to pay for that so that she can make them right, according to the OBR. So what are the impacts of those cuts likely to be? This is from the Department of Work and Pensions' own impact assessments around the cuts. They say this: the potential impact of these reforms on poverty projections has been estimated using a static microsimulation model. Using this model, we estimate there will be an additional 250,000 people, including 50,000 children, in relative poverty after housing costs in 2029, 2030. That's 250,000 people, including 50,000 children. That's as a result of the model changes to Social Security compared to the baseline projections. That's from the Department of Work and Pensions. And focusing just on the toughening of the PIP eligibility criteria, so that's the criteria that people have to satisfy in order to get the support part of PIP, which is, you'll remember, an in-work benefit for many disabled people. The DWP says this: by 2029 to 2030, an estimated 800,000 people will not receive the daily living component of PIP, who would have under the current rules. A significant proportion of these people will retain access to the mobility component and will remain on the benefit. A further 150,000 people will not receive carer's allowance or the universal credit carer element as a result. So that's nearly a million people who would get it today who won't get it in 4 or 5 years' time. People with disabilities in the UK have, of course, seen these kinds of cuts before. They're not a long way from the measures imposed by former Tory Chancellor George Osborne. And beyond the risk of losing the things they need to get by in the world, things that PIP pays for, they also fear the general direction of travel. Novara Media spoke to Caroline Costa at a rally outside Parliament today.
I'm worried that this is just the first step in a series of cuts. That's what really worries me. So yeah, at the moment, I'm okay. As okay as you can be with no hands and feet. But I fear that these cuts will slide further. And I've just lost faith in the Labour government. I've voted Labour all my life, and I feel really let down. The government saying that this will encourage people into work is ridiculous. PIP actually helps people to work. It pays for the extra costs associated with being disabled. So PIP is the gateway to a motability car. If someone who's disabled wants to work and they have to get to work by car, you've just taken away their ability to get to work. So how's that going to help? You know, public transport is not as accessible as it should be. We all know that. You go with the disabled people on the underground, you'll find you can only use a third of stations, and then only with difficulty. Being disabled is really expensive, and this PIP is supposed to help with those extra costs of being disabled. So it pays for my extra electricity and water because it takes me longer to shower. I have to charge devices. It pays for the servicing of my wheelchair, which I have to buy privately because I don't get a folding wheelchair on the NHS. So if you take away PIP, you're actually going to stop people from working. If I had the chance to speak to Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves directly, I'd say to them, come and spend a day with me. Come and spend a day seeing how hard it is for me to do anything. Come and spend a day seeing how much energy it takes anyone who's disabled to just do normal things. And then tell me why you're putting out a green paper, taking away the money that helps me cope and helps me contribute to society, because I do. And then tell me why you're not consulting on the PIP element of these changes, why we haven't got a chance to have our say-so, and why disabled people with limited energy have to come and expend some of that valuable energy to protest here. And tell me why I'm going to be laid out for 3 days after this.
That was Caroline Costa talking at the Disabled People Against the Cuts rally outside Parliament today. Now, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has put out this graph showing how hard these cuts are going to hit people. If you look at this graph, you'll see the green bar shows what someone currently claiming PIP, as well as the health-related top-up to universal credit receives. That's around £1,400 a month. The blue bar on the right shows what a new claimant would receive after Reeves's cuts, that would amount to just £600 a month. So that's a loss of about 800 quid. Now, that's a lot of people, thousands and thousands of people set to be impoverished. Now, there are some rebels amongst Labour's backbench MP, though most of them are currently keeping pretty quiet or briefing anonymously to the papers. But one who isn't is Rachel Maskell, who spoke to Sky after the statement.
What do you feel about a Labour government making these sort of cuts?
Well, I've just made a plea to the Chancellor to say that it's a Labour responsibility to protect the poorest in our society and the most vulnerable. That's why the Labour Party was formed, and I believe today we still hold that moral purpose and must fulfil it.
What's the morale like amongst Labour MPs given all these proposals?
Obviously, across the wider economy, we know we're in a better place now than when we were 2.5 years ago with that disastrous budget, and we're still paying the price for that. But of course, Labour MPs are worried about their constituents who are incredibly vulnerable. We see them in our surgeries, we meet them on the streets, and we need to be able to reassure them that Labour's got their back. And that's why we'll continue to put pressure on the DWP as well as the Treasury to say we need to have proper consultation and therefore protect those people that can't work while helping all those that can into work.
Well, the best way to put pressure on any government is to vote against the measures. Are you going to vote against the welfare cuts when it comes to a vote in Parliament?
I am prepared to vote against those cuts, and I do plead that the government looks at other forms of revenue raising, because having fiscal responsibility is important for everybody across the economy to stop those interest rates rising. But there are other revenues like equalisation around capital gains tax with income tax, but also looking at a wealth tax. Its time has come.
The time for a wealth tax truly has come, even if the government weren't gouging those with illness or disabilities that can't work, and even those who can. A wealth tax is well past time. And it isn't just those of us who don't have a lot that are saying it. Some of the country's wealthiest think so too. Earlier today, I spoke to Stephanie Brobbey, the founder of the Good Ancestor Movement. That's an advisory firm dedicated to supporting pretty well-off individuals and organisations with radical wealth redistribution. Before Stephanie started the Good Ancestor Movement, she was a private wealth lawyer. So I began by asking her to tell us some of the tricks of her former clients might use to avoid paying their share.
Just to contextualise wealth in this country, the top richest 1% households have assets of 3.6 million, right? And so generally you're looking at that kind of level as a starting point, that kind of entry level as a starting point for people that are wealthy and looking to do things like use tax loopholes and do estate planning through tax advisors and private wealth lawyers and a variety of other professionals. And I suppose people would engage in a range of tax avoidance strategies, some of which we've seen addressed to an extent in the budget last year. Things like purchasing agricultural land, really as an investment, because we know like the price of land in the UK just keeps going up and up and up. The value of land, I should say, just keeps climbing. And you know, it's kind of a safety deposit box in the ground for someone that's interested in who may or may not be interested in agricultural property and farming, but is a place where they can park capital and benefit from tax relief, agricultural property relief. Something that is, fairly run of the mill that you'd see, or I would see quite a lot, is the use of business property relief as a loophole. Business property relief was really introduced to mitigate the possibility of small business owners, private business owners, being forced to sell their businesses, or their executors being forced to sell their businesses in the event of their death in order to pay the inheritance tax. And there was 100% relief from inheritance tax. And how the industry, the private wealth industry, financial services industry, responded to this relief was to create bespoke portfolios that have shares, investments, investments in companies that are perhaps they're unlisted, or they're on an alternative on the alternative investment market, and they create a portfolio of investments that would qualify for the relief, provided the individual owned them for at least 2 years, and that would guarantee that they would be inheritance tax free. So you could just tip $1 million or so into a portfolio that's constructed to attract this relief, and that essentially means that people would be able to pass down their assets free of tax, provided they survived the qualifying period.
Yeah, so I guess maybe a way to think about it is the main kinds of tax that the wealthy are currently trying to avoid when they try to avoid it are income tax, inheritance tax, and capital gains tax. And Rachel Reeves today in the spring statement said that she could add to the 6.5 billion that she projected back in October she'd be able to get from closing tax loopholes around those forms of taxation. She could add another billion by tightening it even further. Is this really, in your view, the right strategy for getting at the wealth of the very wealthy, just as it were, coming after them, making it more difficult, making it more increasingly more difficult for them to avoid paying the three major types of tax that they already do pay?
Of course, as a matter of principle, going after tax loopholes, addressing tax avoidance is, of course, really important. As a matter of democracy, we have essentially a two-tier tax system, which means that the very wealthiest in society can get, they can pay for advice and figure out how to reduce or eliminate altogether their tax bills in a way that, ordinary people can't. And so that's always important as a matter of principle. But, in my view, this government has failed consistently to go after, what I deem the most straightforward and simple policy to implement, which would be an annual wealth tax of 2% on assets exceeding £10 million. Now, that would affect directly. It would only affect 20,000 people in this country, which gives you an idea of the scale and the concentration of wealth in this country. And we're talking about people with assets that are multiple properties, maybe some land, like I mentioned, business interests, financial assets like investments, stocks and shares, but other quirky assets like maybe art and wine collections and that sort of thing. And a 2% annual wealth tax on assets exceeding £10 million is, when you think about the kinds of financial returns these people are likely to be receiving from a portfolio of investments, 2% is they're going to be making that money in their sleep.
You often hear a couple of objections to the idea of a wealth tax. So one is that it would be apparently, I don't know, you tell me, very complicated to administer, very complicated sort of process for determining, in fact, actually how wealthy somebody is or what counts as wealth rather than income. And the other, which is pushed by the Tories even over to closing the tax loopholes and small increases to taxes on the richest, is that you have just the flight of millionaires from the country, that we lose the richest or wealthiest people who live here if we were to impose a wealth tax on them on top of the current taxes they already pay. What do you think of those arguments?
Yeah, let me start with the last point you made, which is the idea of, capital flight, people leaving for, in their droves to go to Dubai or Singapore or wherever it is that they want to go. There's research that indicates that those people are unlikely to be paying much tax anyway while they're here, because they're making use of various loopholes and avoiding taxes. They're surrounded by an army of advisors, and so they're not contributing much now, and they wouldn't so that it wouldn't affect the overall position. The other point is that a lot of people are attracted to the UK, even if they're not from here, because there's a kind of a special relationship with UK land and real estate. UK property is fetishized in a way. That's what I observed when I was practicing as a private wealth lawyer. And, those properties aren't going anywhere. They can't pick themselves up and head offshore. They'll remain firmly stuck in the ground here. And so we can tax those assets. I think as to the administrative complexity that people talk about, clearly this government would have to invest in quite a bit of infrastructure, in HMRC to ensure there's compliance. But I think HMRC already has access to a lot of the information it would need in order to ensure that people report properly and pay their taxes properly.
And rather than even trying such a system of wealth tax, we've seen in today's spring statement Rachel Reeves hammering the country's poorest rather than going after the country's wealthiest. And I just wondered, in your work before as a wealth lawyer, and now in your new project, the Good Ancestor Movement, you deal with wealthy people as well. How do they feel about this kind of imbalance in the way in which people are hit by their responsibilities for supporting the country as a whole? What do they think about a wealth tax, for example?
I think, they're aghast. They are, really angry, frankly. I talk about the 2% wealth tax. Well, it doesn't really make a blind bit of difference to someone that's worth, that has assets over £10 million to pay a 2% annual wealth tax. The people that are facing such brutal and savage cuts to their income support, benefits that they might be receiving owing to disabilities, this is going to make an enormous difference. It's going to plunge them into even more financial precarity. I mean, let's face it, nearly half of the people receiving universal credits are actually in work. If that doesn't tell you that work doesn't pay, I don't know what does. And so it's extraordinary when, I work with the super rich every day and, happen to work with people that see their obligation to contribute the most to our public services, to our hospitals, our schools, our care homes. They see that as an extension of their obligation to practice good citizenship. So it's really distressing for them. It's really disappointing. And, I think a disability rights campaigner said last week when the proposals were on the table that, these cuts were barbaric and indefensible. And I'm inclined to agree.
Now, I don't find myself completely convinced about the level of distress the super rich feel about not paying their share. If they did feel that level of distress, they probably wouldn't need wealth lawyers to manage it. Not that I doubt, though, what Stephanie said there. There are certainly some patriotic millionaires, springs to mind, who would like to contribute a bit more. But it's a complete joke when it's the wealthy, even if it's just a few of them, campaigning to pay a bit more rather than like an actual Labour government. And it seems to be a concept, a wealth tax, or even asking the rich for a little bit more, that Rachel Reeves can't even contemplate. Instead, what she's going to do is put her bets on transforming UK industry. Earlier this month, Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that defence spending would rise to 2.5% of GDP. That's an extra £13.5 billion every year from 2027, with Reeves promising £2.2 billion of that in her statement today. And she was really keen to promote the benefits of that cash injection.
As defence spending rises, I want the whole country to feel its benefits. Yeah. So I will now set out the immediate steps that we are taking to boost Britain's defence industry and to make the UK a defence industrial superpower. Yeah. We will spend a minimum of 10% of the Ministry of Defence's equipment budget on new novel technologies, including drones and AI-enabled technology, driving forward advanced manufacturing production in places like Glasgow, in Derby and in Newport, creating demand for highly skilled engineers and scientists, and delivering new business opportunities for UK tech firms and startups.
A defence industrial superpower, a Starship enterprise. we can't even look after those of our fellow citizens who need our help. But we can make sure that we're selling the most advanced drones, AI-guided weapons, and cutting-edge killing machines of every kind to our genocidal allies and authoritarian friends. And that will make us all super wealthy. Helena, before we go on to having a look at some of the details of how the economy is doing, what did you make of, first of all, those cuts, the sharpening of those cuts announced in that spring statement today, and also this idea that we're going to transform ourselves into, I don't know, the industrial capital of offensive weapons making?
Well, when it comes to the cuts that were announced in the spring statement, it was a very good point that you made earlier in your piece there, talking about how it's not actually being done in the interest of people who are out of work or indeed of the disabled. No matter how many times people from the DWP or from the Treasury try and tell us, in reality, we all know it's about penny pinching, hence this last minute freeze to the new claimants of the Universal Credit Health Allowance, because that is what is needed for them to do to be able to hit the fiscal headroom targets as laid out by the projections from the Office of Budget Responsibility. The Tories fell foul of this. Remember, they tried to do welfare reforms last year, and they did a consultation about this to the disabled about what potential cuts would happen. And on judicial review, that consultation was found to be unlawful because it essentially lied about its intentions by trying to claim that it was about helping the disabled, and in reality was about penny pinching to save as much money as they could, regardless of the externalities of the policies that they were putting into place. So what's the current government done? Just thrown them into the spring statement with no consultation at all, because they know that it would get fired back at them, because this is all that it's about. Things got pretty surreal. There was Darren Jones, who is the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, saw him to the left of Rachel Reeves there in the video we just watched, who was on Politics Live today and tried to justify the cuts to PIP, the personal dependence payment, by saying it was like taking away his kids' pocket money and telling them to get a Saturday job. That's a genuine thing that the Chief Secretary of the Treasury said when trying to justify taking money away from some incredibly disabled people. When, of course, as you rightly pointed out too, and as the campaigner who you spoke to in that video we watched as well earlier, pointed out, PIP is an in-work as well as an out-of-work benefit. There are plenty of people who are currently in work who are therefore going to be less likely to stay in work because all of the problems that disability causes them that needs to be rectified, all those additional costs that PIP pays for, that money gets taken away and they'll be less likely to stay in work. They'll have less access to all of the different reasonable adjustments that they would make using that money to their lifestyle to accommodate their disability. So if anything, this is going to mean fewer people are going to be in work. None of this is going to help anybody get back to work. I mean, a bunch of funding for programs to be able to facilitate that, that's all good with me. The right to try these work coaches, any amount of help to be able to get people to navigate the job market, all well and good with me, not a problem. But trying to incentivize this by taking people's money away, this doesn't work. It's trying to expect a plant to grow before you water it, just in the same way that they expect the NHS to be more efficient and to start reducing waiting lists before they pump enough money into it, right? It's a real loser's game that like they were talking about before the election, which is a real problem. Because at the end of the day, this is a health and not a welfare problem. These people are unable to work because they're sick and they need help not to be sick. Okay. When it comes to the defense spending, I'm so skeptical of this for one main reason. The thing that basically every industrialized nation relies upon to ensure that it has a competitive industry is cheap energy. It is having access to cheap energy because it's the main overhead outside of raw materials involved in industrial production. And we have some of the most expensive energy in the world. We certainly have the most expensive energy as a kind of when you do purchasing power parity in Europe, and by quite a large margin because of because we were so heavily exposed to the oil shock a few years ago. And they just cut back a bunch of potential investment which they were going to be borrowing into to feed into their renewable energy plans, to expand the supply of renewable energy, to be able to bring bills down. They could also change marginal cost pricing to bring down the overall cost of energy for businesses and for general residential consumers as well. And they won't do that either. So I maybe I'm just naive when it comes to this and there's a grand plan that I'm missing here, but it seems to me that any desire to revive a manufacturing base in this country will require far more and far cheaper energy than we currently produce in this country, and cutting money from their green prosperity plan, which was something that used to be 28 billion a year and it sounds massively slashed in comparison, to put it into defense spending, which will now be more expensive to maintain because of high energy costs, seems like a real losing game to me. This doesn't feel like it's a particularly salient plan moving forward. Trying to get these investments into left behind areas of the country. Sure, we've lacked industrial strategy to be able to revive the job markets in red wall seats in the Northeast and the West Midlands. But these have been lacking in investment for 45 years. But I don't think these are going to be particularly well paid or good jobs if the overheads for these public investment projects are too high because we've not bothered investing in having a competitive energy sector.
Yeah, I think one of my big problems with this move to the defense side of things is that, we had this plan. The last one was to have a sort of green energy revolution, and that was going to create all the jobs. And now suddenly, it's not entirely been ditched, but suddenly, as you say, money is being moved out of it into this new sector. And, one of the things about defense is that it's kind of an illusion that people actually make things by themselves. One of the reasons why we can't, why the government hasn't stopped the supply of F-35 parts to Gaza is because we don't actually make the F-35s. We make components of them in a large chain of a sort of global supply chain, which then ends up constructing them. But we're not in control of where they go or who gets them. And I think a lot of advanced technologies involving weaponry are exactly the same. There's not a lot. It's not like the old days where you're making guns. It's like very, very complicated, advanced machinery with a lot of components that enters a global supply chain where they're constructed in various places with various shareholders owning the outcome. And it just doesn't seem realistic to me to think that actually the industry, the kind of industry that Rachel Reeves is talking about is really going to return in a substantial way to those parts of the UK. What do you think?
I think that's broadly true. I absolutely do agree with that. And there's also the other problem, of course, which is that if we're going to be investing in something, especially into the supply side of the economy, we want these to be the kind of commodities that circle within the economy. They're able there to, we had an inflationary crisis because demand outstripped supply. So if we want to increase the level of supply, then we're going to have to put these into regular consumer items that are going to be part of everyday consumption. Fighter jets that sit around in hangars for the RAF, these aren't consumable items that are going to help the wider economy. Sure, it might be good investments in terms of the jobs that it will create, but is it really going to be sustainable in the long term? Is it really going to have many returns for the state in terms of people purchasing our parts internationally, as you say? And is it actually going to be the kind of Keynesian multiplier in terms of state spending that you would have gotten with investment in the energy sector or in production, for example, of green steel? If we say, for example, nationalised our steel industry, saved a bunch of these forgotten areas of the country that are losing steel jobs, and use that to maintain a both sustainable and geopolitically stable as well as environmentally stable supply chain for steel, which I think would be a better expenditure of government resources.
Yeah, I think that's a scary thing about the defense sector. The point you just made there. It's all very well thinking, okay, we'll invest a bunch of money and we'll procure some weapons, and then we'll have done it, and they'll sit there until it's time to use them. But actually, that's not a very productive use of that money. What you have to do is make sure they are in fact used, so that you can make more and replace them. And yeah, that is the dangerous compulsion of being in the defense industry. Is that, or having it as part of your industrial strategy, a big part of that strategy is that at some point, if you want it to be sustainable and continuous, you're going to have to use those weapons. You're going to have to find a reason to use them, or the people you're selling them onto are going to have to find a reason to use them. That's very dangerous stuff. Let's go on to a different figure that appeared in the spring statement this morning. And when I say figure, I mean a kind of character, although it's not really a character, it's more of a blob. The Office for Budget Responsibility played, as it often does, an outsized role in Rachel Reeves' spring statement. It's their job to look at the government's economic plans and say what impacts they've already had, as well as what their future consequences will be. It was the OBR's complaints over the welfare cuts that made Reeves go back for more. It was them pointing out that actually her figures didn't make up the $5 billion she was looking for, so she chose to go back and squeeze a little bit more out of the sick and disabled. And it was this change, there was another change, to their projections, not to do with cuts, but rather with the economy in general, that brought the biggest reaction from the House of Commons today.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this month, the OECD downgraded this year's growth forecast for every G7 economy, including the UK. And the OBR have today revised down our growth forecast for 2025, from 2% in the autumn to 1% today.
So just to be clear, that's the OBR downgrading the country's growth from figures they gave just 6 months ago. In October, the OBR predicted GDP growth would be 2%. That's the bar in yellow. That's now been halved by the OBR to under 1%, the bar in grey. And of course, in her speech, what Reeves really wanted to focus on was the future years, 2026 and onwards, where growth is forecast higher. But if the OBR got it so wrong just 6 months ago about growth this year, who's to say that these figures on future years are going to stick after the next budget or next month or next week? But it gets even worse. The OBR revised up the size of the UK workforce by 500,000 people, and yet still predicts that projected GDP growth will halve. So that shows, put together, a really alarming drop in productivity. The workforce is bigger, and yet GDP distributed across that workforce is dramatically lower. In fact, the OBR says that by the end of 2024, output per hour worked, which is one measure of productivity, had dropped by 1.3% compared to what it said just 6 months ago. This graph shows the OBR's revised productivity predictions in terms of output per hour work. You can see how the new forecast of this one measure of productivity, the solid blue line, diverges radically from what it said 6 months ago. That's the yellow line. But it's also these scenarios that they include there, the dashed blue lines, varying absolutely wildly depending on circumstances, that really grabbed my attention. On one, we quickly catch up with October's forecast. On the other, we pretty much flatline. And you can imagine there are just infinitely many scenarios in between. Now, output per hour worked is related to per capita GDP. And per capita real GDP is the size of the economy divided by the number working in it. It shows how much each working person is contributing to the size of the economy. In their forecast, the OBR included this one pretty shocking fact. The level of productivity, measured output per hour work, at the end of 2024 was 1.3% lower than in the October forecast. In growth rate terms, productivity fell 0.4% in 2023 and a further 1% in 2024. Real GDP per capita at the end of 2024 was also 0.7% below the October forecast and 1.1% lower than its level at the end of 2019. So 5 years since the pandemic began, and productivity is still 1% lower than it was in 2019. I mean, that looks to me at the level of per capita GDP like a recession. Helena, what's your take on that?
So I mentioned before that the issue with regards to our labour force participation is not a welfare problem, but a healthcare sector problem. Now, I've talked many times before now that from 2010 until 2019, the Conservative government of the time, with George Osborne as Chancellor, reduced the per capita spending on the NHS the percentage of healthcare spending of GDP every single year from 2010 until 2019. So this means that our country was getting sicker, our waiting lists were increasing, more people were out of work, and people who were still in work, because of the stripping away of the public realm, have not been productive. This is the biggest result, in my mind, of the austerity politics of George Osborne and co. from 2010 until 2016, and the continuation of that by Philip Hammond as Chancellor under Theresa May, is that this has been a grand stifling of productivity increases in our economy. And it's not just healthcare that's a problem. Anything else that might damage people's overall health is also something that has these recurrent effects throughout the population in terms of stifling productivity. And this could be any amount of reduction in public spending on things that maintain our workforce being healthy and educated. For example, the fact that we had stripping away in the education budget. We have schools that are full of dodgy concrete, right? We don't have the kind of pay awards in some sectors of the economy that may give people the incentive to work hard and be productive. So there are loads and loads and loads of problems that we're seeing at the moment. And again, this drive to try and see if you can cut welfare into getting people into work when people need the healthcare to fix the problem, when the fact that 40% of people who claim a bunch of disability or who claim out of work incapacity are waiting for NHS care. They're on an NHS waiting list. This is a problem of austerity that has caused this. So the idea that the medicine that should be administered to this ailing patient should be even more austerity is balmy. It's totally balmy. You know, what's the definition of madness? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, that's the position that we're in at the moment. There's a second problem that we have with regards to productivity, because the other kind of driver of productivity is innovation. And we don't have an innovative economy. We have a rentier economy, because it's much easier to be able to make money by pumping liquidity into an inflated housing market, which has been over-financialized, a bloated financial sector that strips away at the productivity of the real economy, because it's the cost of doing business for everybody else. This isn't the kind of innovative economy that we could be having. And of course, we don't have any real state expenditure in R&D. You know, one of the biggest drivers of technological innovation in the States for the period up until the end of the Cold War was DARPA, the Defense Product Research Agency, you know? This was their way of being able to create all the new technology that created more efficient ways of working, that meant that per hour worked, you got more productivity, you produced more per worker. It made people's labor more efficient at creating more commodities, right? And this was something that was done through government funding. This was a state-funded department, essentially created by the United States to try and maintain technological parity with the Soviet Union, who were also engaging in a bunch of state innovation at the time. This was the product of Cold War arms race, I guess, even though it had plenty of other applications that were for domestic reasons. That was in the innovation that we got. And in a neoliberal world, people aren't incentivized to do this because you just reinvent the wheel, or you speculate on financial assets or physical assets and wait for them to increase in value. This is why we've run deficits for so long and we engaged in so much QE, is because we've had to try and make sure to maintain aggregate demand. Yanis Varoufakis makes this point about all of this new central bank money that we've had over the past 15 years, is that we've stagnated broadly the neoliberal economies have, because we've not tried to do what Harold Wilson wanted to do, which was take advantage of the white heat of technology. We've just tried to become speculators. And this is a problem that we have, is that whenever we talk about the problems in our economy, especially when the Labour Party talk about it, when the Labour Party are describing the financial inheritance that they came into in 2024, they bang on about Liz Truss. Liz Truss this, Liz Truss that. Whilst she was bad, she did bad things. The result of what happened when she was in government was that the pension fund's overall position was reduced and interest rates went up. When if you want to actually look at long-term damage to our economy, that's been the fiscal inheritance, right? It's George Osborne that's the main culprit of all of the biggest woes that we see in our economy post-financial crisis, because we were in a liquidity trap where we could have invested in R&D, we could have invested in industrial production, we could have invested in new infrastructure, and instead we closed libraries in Wolverhampton, and we have a sicker, a more unhappy and less productive population as a result. And so trying to repeat those mistakes rather than reimagining what the state could do and what the state could be, I think that Mariana Mazzucato's book, The Entrepreneurial State, is a really good prospectus on how you can use the role of the state in becoming innovative and driving productivity. That could be a way that they could change the game. They could be creating something far more dynamic and something with far more growth potential, both in real terms and per capita, and more productive. But these people aren't visionaries. The Labour Party are not visionary. They are not there to try and govern through an ideology or through any kind of plan. They are accidentally in government, having not expected to be because of Liz Truss, and are making things up as they go. And it's very depressing that in the time when we could be having a real reimagining of what the British country and the British economy could look like, we are just getting the Treasury copybook being rolled out again and again and again and again, and nothing will probably change if we continue with this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I introduced that section by talking about the OBR, and the OBR would obviously be a huge hindrance on whether you could ever do anything like that, right? The OBR has got such a grip on how the Treasury thinks about fiscal planning, in the sense that, it takes some data, you give it your policies, and then it makes these predictions, which, as we saw, varied wildly across 6 months, because, of course, things change across 6 months. And yet it's always the OBR's forecasts, which are very conservative forecasts and based on absolute sort of Treasury-minded thinking about economics, that determine whether or not markets are going to ditch us, or whether or not people will stick with you as an electorate. Just very, very quickly, what do you think of the role in the OBR in this spring statement and in general?
I mean, they keep getting things wrong anyway. Why should we continue to trust them? Just revising predictions over and over and over again. They've proven really that they are just a straitjacket, just like the fiscal rules were a straitjacket. Trying to adhere to Treasury orthodoxy is a similar straitjacket. When you look at the economy that's been performing the best over the past 4 years post-pandemic, right? The one that's recovered best out of the pandemic, it was the United States. It was the United States that were running 7% deficits. The bond vigilantes were proven wrong because they ran these gigantic deficits. And what did they do? It was put into green technological production, which created jobs for people, even in rural states in Republican areas where they tried to claim credit for the Inflation Reduction Act. It did reduce inflation because it increased the supply of commodities in the economy. And they were able to put this into things like the expanded child tax credit that reduced poverty in children massively. It was just stupid of them that they ever let it run out in the first place, So there is plenty of room, I think, for far more radical thinking on the economy. It just involves trying to remove yourself from the institutions that would try and tie you to the last 45 years of kind of fiscal orthodoxy, as you say. But these people don't want to do that. In fact, they want to do the opposite. Rachel Reeves introduced legislation to make the OBR even more powerful, which is bonkers to be totally counterproductive.
It is bonkers, but Rachel Reeves clearly loves a straitjacket. Israel kills a child in Gaza every 45 minutes. That's an average of 30 children killed every day over the past 535 days. Those are just two statistics published in a new report by Al Jazeera on the impact of Israel's war on Gaza. And using data from the Gaza Health Ministry, Save the Children, and the United Nations, they show that if you had a room with 100 children in Gaza before the war, this would now be the typical result. 2 of them would have been killed. 3 of them would have been wounded, probably critically. 2 would be missing, presumed dead. 5 would require treatment for acute malnutrition. And 5 would have been orphaned or separated from their parents. The surgeon Feroz Sidwa reported last year about how injuries inflicted on Gaza's children appear deliberate, not at all accidental. He's now back working in the Strip again, and he spoke to Mehdi Hassan on Tuesday about the children being brought into the hospital where he works.
Kids are being killed in Gaza the same way everyone else is, by getting blown up. That's the vast majority of injuries. And right now, when we were here last year, 40 to 50% of the casualties we're seeing, and most of the severely injured casualties are kids. It's mostly with shrapnel injuries and explosions. Like just last night, maybe starting at it was about midnight actually when I went down to the ER. There was an Apache helicopter gunship attack on apparently just a few blocks that way. And I don't know if it was on a car or a building or what, but the one man and 4 children came in from that incident. A 10-year-old girl who probably is going to lose at least 2 of her limbs, if not 3 in the end. And then 2, 4, or 5-year-old boys. I'm not sure exactly how old they were. The first came in with a devastating brain injury. He was still breathing, actually, but we don't have a neurosurgeon here, and we don't have the capacity to take care of a child that's sick. So we just had to he had agonal breathing, which means he was just a few moments away from dying. We told his dad to pick him up and take him over to the area where dead kids are allowed to die with their families. That's a real thing in the emergency room here. And then the next kid that came in, also 4 or 5 years old, also had a devastating brain injury. He was eviscerated, meaning his intestines were on his outside because his abdomen had been torn open. And we had to tell his family the exact same thing. A man came in with these huge wounds on his legs and his buttocks. Whether he was the target of the attack, I have no idea. But I know he was the father of the little girl that I just talked about, who's probably going to lose, who could conceivably lose 3 out of her 4 limbs. And he died this morning from blood loss and maybe from what's called a fat embolism, but it doesn't really matter. So yeah, we're still seeing, honestly, half, if not more, children who are injured.
That's the incredibly brutal cost of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Children losing 2, if not 3 limbs. What a phrase. She's going to lose 2, if not 3 limbs. Their parents dying of blood loss. Despite the extent of the onslaught in Gaza, lots of media in the West over the past couple of days have been keen to suggest that Palestinians in Gaza are turning against Hamas.
Hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza are protesting against Hamas for a second day in a row. This video shows people holding signs saying, quote, "Enough displacement and homelessness, stop the war, and we refuse to die." Now we're learning an unidentified group is calling for more demonstrations across Gaza. ABC's Matt Rivers joins me from Jerusalem with the latest. Matt, how big of a deal are these protests against Hamas, and how could this impact the war?
Yeah, Diane, it is a big deal. There's no question. I mean, here in Jerusalem, we're not far from the Prime Minister's residence, and this is a protest behind me where there have just been continual protests here in Jerusalem for a long time now against the war, against the Prime Minister. We're very used to protests on this side of the border. Over in Gaza, not so much. These protests are pretty extraordinary in the sense that they're being called for around Gaza. Anti-Hamas protests basically saying, let us live. That is essentially the theme of those protests. And so, where it goes from here, what impact it has on the war remains to be seen. But we know that sustained popular movements can make a difference here. It can put pressure on Hamas. And so that's certainly what they're trying to do. But I think the real question here is it's kind of a time will tell thing, Diane. To have an impact, those protests over in Gaza would have to be sustained, last for a while.
This is so jokes. I mean, honestly, that reporting is so weak and such a reach. I mean, they describe it as, I think the BBC described it as the biggest anti-Hamas protest Gaza has seen since the beginning of the war. What does that say? The biggest they've seen since the beginning of the war. You've got to give me some context. You've got to tell me how many people there are. He described it as like building a mass movement, and yet the anchor described it as hundreds of people. I mean, it's crazy. Of course, Gaza is a diverse population full of people who have different opinions about Hamas. Just because some in that community or in that population are protesting, and again, we don't know how big it is. Those broadcasters don't even have any journalists in the strip to for example, count them or give an assessment of their size. So of course there are going to be some people who disagree with Hamas, but I think the way that Western media is like really reaching for the idea that these are like widespread anti-Hamas protests, that they will somehow turn the tide and cause Hamas to, I don't know, give up the hostages or give up, as though Hamas is the generator of the carnage that we've just seen in the section above, as though it's Hamas directly causing the killing and the loss of 2 or 3 limbs by individual children in Gaza. Helena, what do you make of the reporting on these protests? Do you think these are widespread anti-Hamas protests in Gaza?
Well, I was reading a report from Alistair Bunkle, who's a correspondent for Sky News, and he was pointing out that a bunch of claims around these being broadly anti-Hamas were probably over-egging the pudding somewhat, and that there were some anti-Hamas chants that were heard, but these are anti-war demonstrations, right? Obviously, people are going to be frustrated and going to be angry and they're going to be upset with what's happening and they want to take political action. But the broad scale of what the protests were anti-war protests. You saw lots of anti-Israel things. There were some people who were anti-Hamas. Of course, no one in Palestine, at least not in Gaza, is a monolith with regards to their opinions of Hamas or with regards to Israel or the Palestinian Authority or whatever. But as you say, like clearly what is important here and what people understand is that Israel has to bear responsibility because they're the ones who have decided to do the genocide, right? That's the long and short of it, even though there probably are plenty of people who are frustrated with being governed by Hamas. And there have always been a contingent of Palestinians who do not. like being governed by a military group, for example. And I've got to remember that the reason why we're here isn't just because Israel decided to do genocide, and they have been doing so for the last 18 months. They were the ones who collapsed the ceasefire. It was Hamas coming to the table and Israel then actually agreeing to the terms that were put forward, that Hamas have been happy to agree to forever, that have brought the ceasefire into place in the first place, which Israel then broke. Now, what I was doing, though, in my research for this bit, was looking at some polling of the opinions of Palestinians so we get a broader idea rather than just looking at anecdotes of what people hear and see at protests or broader opinions on armed struggle against Israel and the Palestinian resistance forces. When I was looking in this, the most recent I could find were from September. And whilst support for Hamas in the Gaza Strip specifically has dropped, I think from around 38 to 35% from June last year to September last year, there's still a plurality of support for Hamas over the Palestinian Authority. There is still broader support for Hamas leaders over Fatah leaders, for example, in terms of how people would vote in presidential elections, even though Marwan Barghouti is probably the most favoured amongst the Gazans and, of course, within the West Bank as well. And the approach of the Palestinians would rather see towards Palestinian statehood overwhelmingly, not just in plurality, but in majority, in the Gaza Strip, people support continuing armed resistance against Israel. So whilst Hamas's popularity has waned in the Gaza Strip, and they still don't have more than around a third or so of support within the people who live there, this idea that there is going to be this broad movement to depose them amongst the Palestinian population, this is for the birds. There are some people who are protesting, but this is not the broader representation of their opinions. And of course, what you're seeing outside of, I think, Sky News I found and NBC that I found, basically every other news site is broadcasting these and framing these as anti-Hamas protests as if that is the entirety of the people who are there, when it just isn't. The more fair report I saw from Sky News correctly identified that there were some people who were saying these things, but those were just chants that were heard. You can't characterize these broadly anti-war protests as being specifically anti-one group just because you heard a couple of people chant some things. And so I think that there has been a real lack of due diligence or a deliberate narrativization from a bunch of Western news outlets when talking about these protests, when you look at the actual data of Palestinians' opinions over the governance of the Gaza Strip.
The Trump administration is still refusing to take any responsibility for inviting a top journalist into a national security group chat and then planning a military attack on Yemen while said journalist was reading. This is what Donald Trump had to say.
There was no classified information, as I understand it. They used a app, if you want to call it an app. But sometimes somebody can get onto those things. That's one of the prices you pay when you're not sitting in the situation room with no phones on, which is always the best, frankly.
Someone can get onto one of those things, those apps. Now, Jeffrey Goldberg, the Atlantic editor who was invited into the chat with the vice president, CIA director, and secretary of state, says he saw the timing and location of attacks on Yemen before they happened, which sounds like information that probably should be classified, although he did keep it to himself. But the man who invited him into the signal group, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, has remained pretty defiant.
There's a lot of journalists in this city who have made big names for themselves, making up lies about this president, whether it's the Russia hoax or making up lies about Gold Star families. And this one in particular, I've never met, don't know, never communicated with. And we are looking into and reviewing how the heck he got into this room.
I let in a journalist to our secret war planning group, but it's the journalist's fault for being a bad guy. It's not exactly the best line of defense I've ever heard. And CIA Director John Ratcliffe had an even simpler one.
Director Ratcliffe, this was a huge mistake, correct?
No.
No. It was a tiny one. Meanwhile, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth claimed Jeffrey Goldberg didn't really see anything significant at all.
Why were those details shared on Signal, and how did you learn that a journalist was privy to the targets, the types of weapons used?
I've heard I was characterized. Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
Jeffrey Goldberg disagreed with that statement.
Secretary Hegseth there saying that nobody was texting war plans. Given you were privy to this group chat, is that how you saw it?
No, that's a lie. He was texting war plans. He was texting attack plans, when targets were going to be targeted, how they were going to be targeted, who was at the targets, when the next sequence of attacks were happening. I didn't publish this, and I continue not to publish it because it felt like it was too confidential, too technical, and I worry, honestly, that sharing that kind of information in public could endanger American military personnel.
Goldberg there explained why he hadn't published the war plans he said he'd seen, but that has now changed. Today, The Atlantic published a follow-up article to their original report. It's called "Here Are the Attack Plans That Trump's Advisors Shared on Signal." This is a part of that piece. As we wrote on Monday, much of the conversation in the Houthi PC small group concerned the timing and rationale of attacks on the Houthis and contained remarks by Trump administration officials about the alleged shortcomings of America's European allies. But on the day of the attack, Saturday, March 15th, the discussion veered towards the operational. And this is the key operational message. It's sent at 11:44, so before any attacks had begun. Time now, 11:44. Weather is favorable, just confirmed with CENTCOM. We are go for mission launch. 12:15, F-18's launch, first strike package. 13:45, trigger-based F-18, first strike window starts. Target terrorist is at his known location, so should be on time. Also strike drones launch. 14:10, more F-18s launch. 14:15, strike drones on target. This is when the first bombs will definitely drop, pending earlier trigger-based targets. Remember what Hegseth was telling journalists on Monday? Quote, "Nobody was texting war plans." Well, what you've just seen there are blow-by-blow war plans, including the times and locations that targets would be hit. And regardless of what you think about Americans bombing Yemen, security cock-ups do not get much bigger than that. Helena, this is a pretty massive fuck-up. By anybody's standards. What do you think the fallout of it is going to be for Pete Hegseth and for others involved?
Well, it's funny to me how when it came to administrations like the George W. Bush administration, it was just the figurehead that was a complete lunatic and a dunderhead. And it turns out the current administration in America seems to be a DEI program for stupid people. Just get these people into government and give them jobs that they clearly, in what the Republicans mind in terms of DEI, are things that they're completely unqualified for. I mean, I was watching some of the Senate Intelligence Committee the other day, and these people are just idiots. Like, I'm sorry. We've seen the statements made now in the Senate Intelligence Committee by people like Tulsi Gabbard and John Ratcliffe and Kash Patel. And specifically when it comes to Ratcliffe and Gabbard, both of them claimed that there was nothing of classified information in the statements that were made in the Signal chat. And we now know that's just obviously not true. I mean, I think that there will be serious ramifications. I mean, under any normal administration, we'd expect people to be sacked, like on the spot, for even being as careless to include an Atlantic journalist in their Signal group for war plans. This should be a very easy decision for any normal administration to sack these people for such a gigantic security breach, regardless of the ramifications of what's being planned. We've not even gotten into the fact that these were attacks which killed civilians in Yemen, of course, which you would have thought would have been really important for the Atlantic to share before they happened, to try and ensure that America didn't engage in huge amounts of belligerent warfare in the Middle East. But regardless, even so, you've got to wonder how close Jeffrey Goldberg must be to the intelligence community who is even included in this group to begin with. But I don't think we'll see any amount of sackings or firings of any of these people, because as the Trump campaign have made very, very clear, basic competency is not a metric with which that they adhere to when choosing their political allies or their political appointments. It's all about loyalty. It's all about loyalty and what utility they have to the central project from the people in the background for the people who are actually masterminding the whole project from start to finish. That's what's important. It's having people in powerful positions who will do what you tell them to do and will parrot the party lines and will absolutely stonewall any criticism of the administration itself to maintain power and maintain control. Any amount of due diligence or respect for the roles which they've been appointed to, none of these things are relevant when the only thing that you care about is power and the maintenance of that as well. So do I think there will be any actual consequences other than embarrassment for these people? No, not really.
For me, I think one of the most remarkable and also kind of funny parts of this story is that, The Atlantic is the outlet of choice for Washington hawks. And it's no surprise to me that Jeffrey Goldberg is close to the thinking and the talking about these operations. And as you say, despite being in receipt of information surrounding impending belligerent bombing of another nation, he chose to keep that under his hat. But what he couldn't keep under his hat is that there was a security breach, that there was a failure within the intelligence community that he's so close to. So not the moral failure of bombing children, but the sort of administrative failure of allowing a journalist inadvertently into that group. But I think he would have kept completely silent about the details of what was said in that group if he hadn't been undermined by the administration. If the administration hadn't said, "Oh, actually, this guy just thinks he saw something important, but he never saw anything important at all." And now, the story has got much bigger because they not only, as it were, violated the security protocols by having him in there, but once they had him in there, they couldn't even keep him on side. It's pathetic. Like, whatever happened to the CIA? Why didn't they just, have a quiet word?
Well, I mean, I think that once the attacks had been carried out, I don't think they would have cared, right? The concerns that they have over American military interventionism, for example, American military action, is only their concern up to the point at which those attacks happen. Once the attacks have happened, I think it was fair game. My assumption from all of this, so this is just my assumption and my intuition rather than something that that's come from actual specific evidence, to take it how you will. It's my belief that I think that the Atlantic knew there would be a Senate Intelligence Committee, because it was obviously scheduled for last night or yesterday afternoon in the States. So they would be able to release the knowledge that they were in the group chat, and because obviously journalists aren't stupid, they know when to release information for maximum impact and maximum traffic to drive AdSense revenue and engagement, because that's what news websites are for in the 21st century. And so by releasing a small amount of information before the Intelligence Committee, they would be very easy for them to be able to trap people like Gabbard and Ratcliffe into saying things that weren't true after he'd previously said on CNN, "No, I'm not going to actually release any of the messages." And then obviously the attacks happen. And then it's fine to release the messages now because you're not compromising the military security of the attacks that you support, most likely. And then as soon as they've gone into the Intelligence Committee and then they've essentially lied about the fact that there's classified information in these text messages, he then has carte blanche to release them and then trap them in the vice of his own making, whilst not undermining what he believes are the legitimate security concerns of America with regards to their belligerence in the Middle East. So it's a win-win as far as the American war hawks are concerned, because they get to pinch a move on the people who they believe are unfit for government, whilst also not actually undermining American imperialism in the Middle East.
Scooby-Doo, where are you? We've got a mystery on our hands. Last night, Sky News aired a 10-minute interview with former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. In it, Sophie Ridge asked him a range of questions over Ukraine, austerity, and of course, Israel's genocide in Gaza. But there was one issue Ridge just couldn't resist bringing up.
Now, there'll be some who, I'll be honest, think I shouldn't be interviewing you on Gaza because you're expelled from Labour after a highly critical report by the Equality and Human Rights Watchdog about anti-Semitism.
I was not expelled for anti-Semitism.
About after your response to the report from the Equalities and Human Rights Watchdog about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party under your watch. They say that they were concerned by lack of leadership in the Labour Party on those issues. What would you say to that?
Two things. One is anti-Semitism is an evil, and one anti-Semite in any party is one too many, and I said that at the time. What I did say, and I stand by, was that many of the claims were made were actually fallacious claims that were not borne out by any fact or any investigation. There was an exaggeration of them. However, I'm stand by the issue that anti-Semitism is an evil within our society in exactly the same way Islamophobia is an evil within our society. What's going on in Gaza is a crime against humanity, as the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and the Geneva Convention on the responsibilities of occupying powers have shown.
Some people think I shouldn't even speak to you because of some confected, media-driven nonsense that happened 6 or more years ago. Now, look, Corbyn has answered those questions over and over again. He's been tortured by them, constantly having to relitigate a position he's made clear time and time again. But if that wasn't bad enough, and here's where the mystery, the shenanigans come in. When I watched the uploaded version of the interview earlier today, I noticed a whole chunk had disappeared. In fact, what Sky did was first upload the full version, then bin it, then re-upload a new version a few hours later with a minute and a half cut out. Luckily, our amazing producer Gary managed to get the original. Here's a section Sky tried to stop us seeing.
You say that anti-Semitism is evil, that it's wrong. You are also a member of the Independent Alliance Party.
It's a group. Not
a group,
party, yeah.
Yes, apologies, a grouping.
Yeah.
Just to look at some of the examples of people in the grouping, Ayub Khan resigned from the Lib Dems after being ordered to undertake anti-Semitism training, which he disagreed with. Adnan Hussein, at a rally in 2014, claimed Israel's military operation was a Holocaust. Mohammed Iqbal was suspended from Labour after allegedly making anti-Semitic comments at a meeting. I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you feel it is wrong that you have been expelled from Labour for these reasons, you're not really helping the case for the defence here, are you?
They are good colleagues, and they're very good at representing their constituency and very determined to bring about peace and justice for the Palestinian people. They have exactly the same views as all the rest of us are, that racism is an evil in society. They have themselves suffered racism as Muslim people. They do not want to put the same onto Jewish people. And so we've had plenty of discussion.
So you're comfortable with all of these? Have you spoken to them about some of these reports?
I work with them. We work with them, and we particularly raise issues of human rights. We raise issues about refugees. We raise issues about bringing peace to the Middle East. Surely that is a good way forward.
Now, we don't know exactly why Sky scrapped that question. There does seem to be one pretty humiliating factual error in there, with Ridge embarrassingly confusing independent MP Iqbal Mohammed with a Labour councillor called Mohammed Iqbal. Let me just say that again. Independent MP Iqbal Mohammed has never been accused of anti-Semitism of any kind. And I think the councillor, Mohammed Iqbal, was accused but was reinstated by the Labour Party. But as if that wasn't embarrassing enough, this whole line of questioning it's cringe, it's desperate, it's deeply lazy journalism. And its whole point is that it wants to make Jeremy Corbyn answer for other MPs who aren't there to speak for themselves in an attempt to discredit him and them as effective voices for Gaza. It wants to group them together, use the word anti-Semitism, and therefore cancel out their voices, their very loud voices, as they stand up for Palestinians being blown to pieces in Gaza. Helena, I think you did see the full interview. What did you make of it?
Yeah, we watched this on stream. And, the mix-up with regards to Iqbal Mohammed versus Mohammed Iqbal was something that I found out with 5 minutes of Googling midstream. If I can do that, and we can do that, but the Sky News people who are there to research this stuff can't do that, what does it say about our legacy media that a 5-minute Google search to try and fact check their own claims before broadcasting wasn't something that they were able to do before even interviewing Jeremy Corbyn in the first place, let alone before it's been broadcast the first time? The claim about Ayub Khan, one of the other independent MPs, was regarding him leaving the Liberal Democrats because of being asked to do anti-Semitism training for statements that he'd made. The statements that he made was asking for the footage from October the 7th that was only shown to journalists to be broadcast publicly and questioning Israeli claims over beheaded babies on October the 7th. which he was right to question, because it turns out it was all total nonsense made up by an Israeli NGO worker. There was no basis in fact, even when Joe Biden pretended that he'd seen the photos that didn't exist. And this is, again, as you say, actually, despite how kind of funny it is looking at the failure of legacy media to be able to report things properly, but the broader point here is that they were trying to discredit his own personal position, talking in that longer interview about what's going on in Gaza, his criticisms, his legitimate and factual criticisms of our government's not only kind of tacit complicity by being diplomatically tied to Israel, by still selling them 90% of the weapon licenses that we've currently got that are active outside of the ones that have been cancelled by David Lammy, but we're also a direct participant with regards to how we're getting military flights going from RAF Akrotiri to fly over Israel, even land in Tel Aviv. There was a transport just a couple of days ago, a very large transport that flew from Akrotiri to Tel Aviv. So we not just have some tacit endorsement, but direct endorsement of what's happening in Gaza through our diplomatic alignment with Israel. These were all very legitimate criticisms. And the point that Sophie Ridge made, that, as you said, was you can't really speak about this because you were removed for anti-Semitism, when of course we have seen the Anushka Astana report in The Observer. She's clearly demonstrated, showing that people on the right of the Labour Party were trying to amplify dubious claims of anti-Semitism in random Facebook groups to smear the Labour leadership and the Labour Party more broadly, to try and bring down Jeremy Corbyn. We know that his statement that he made after the EHRC report is based in fact from what we know now. So to try and relitigate this, to undermine his genuine, principled stance against our government's complicity with the genocide in Gaza is, as far as I'm concerned, tantamount to journalistic malpractice.
Yeah, Jeremy Corbyn is a man, an extremely rare politician who I think has very rarely ever done anything just for himself. So all his politics, whether it's here in the UK or whether it's abroad, are completely centered on the most disadvantaged, the most crushed, the most destroyed. And because he won't stop talking about it, he has to constantly be tortured by this nonsense that occurred in our politics 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago now. Just give the man a break. Okay, Helena.
Yeah, honestly, true.
Thank you very much for joining me. It's been a great show.
As always, a pleasure, and looking forward to the next time as always.
Yeah, me too. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.